Thanks for joining today. I really appreciate your coming here. I know there's lots of really great sessions available for you over the next couple of days. So grateful that you are taking your time to learn more about the resettlement landscape here in Minnesota. My name is Rachele King, and I serve as State Refugee Coordinator at the Minnesota Department of Human Services. So as we get started, I just wanted to set a little bit of a level set for us here about why providing humanitarian protection is important. It is the federal government that oversees immigration. It is the federal government that determines how many people are permitted, what is their classification of entry, and the status that they receive. But people are residents of states and counties and cities. So while immigration law and its impacts can feel really inaccessible because of the federal responsibility there, we know that those decisions have impacts to our local communities, and you guys are on the front lines of that. And so for the purposes of this conversation today, we're really going to focus on people at a very high level who are provided a humanitarian protection status. It is important for us, and the first next to the U.S. flag there is an excerpt that was taken from the U.S. Department of State's website. And in Minnesota, we know that immigrants and refugees provide a story of resilience and hope, and that their resiliency strengthens the future of Minnesota. A little background about the office that I lead at the Minnesota Department of Human Services, and how that relates to a glimpse of the Minnesota tradition of welcome. So in 1975, Governor Wendell Anderson established an office called the Indo-Chinese Refugee Resettlement Office. And that office was created to coordinate efforts between federal and voluntary agencies here in Minnesota to provide assistance and follow-up services to Indo-Chinese refugees. Later, that office was expanded to include refugees from other countries. And so this program was actually moved from the governor's office to the Department of Human Services in 1981 and renamed the Resettlement Programs Office, which is what we remain named today. So we've been there ever since. And so what that means is that this year, Minnesota is really celebrating 50 years of welcome and engagement in this work. And what you can see on here, so the Resettlement Programs Office fulfills a federal requirement for every state that welcomes people through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program that's established in federal statute, the federal requirement to have a state coordinating entity for resettlement that liaisons with the federal government and with the local community to coordinate public and private resources to help people establish well-being and progress towards self-sufficiency as quickly as possible. So in this role, our office creates a state plan for resettlement in cooperation with colleagues at the Minnesota Department of Health. And as I said, liaison with federal partners. We consult with local stakeholders about resettlement capacity in Minnesota, and we administer funding for eligible populations for up to their first 5 years in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we could talk for months, probably at this point, about resettlement, about immigration in our community. But as I mentioned, for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to talk about kind of focus on four areas: the pathways to humanitarian protection status, current trends in Minnesota, the network of service structure that exists in Minnesota, and then end with some of the economic impacts of resettlement in Minnesota. And with that, as we get started, I wanted to just start by doing a little quiz. I know you are all educators, so a quiz is right down your alley to look at a little bit of history in Minnesota. As I mentioned earlier, migration, immigration, it's not new to Minnesota. We have a rich tradition of that here in Minnesota. So I just wanted to start with a quick couple questions here to see if people know which year saw the highest percentage of foreign-born people living in Minnesota. Feel free to drop it in the chat if you think you know. So we have 1920, 1970, 2015, and 2022. Oh yeah, see, good educators are participating. I really appreciate that. Okay, so I'm seeing different answers. I'm seeing 2015, 2022, I'm seeing all the answers. Well, the correct answer is actually A. So in 1920, 20% or 1 in 5 people living in the United States were born outside of the United States. So we have this perception that it's more now than it has ever been. But our immigrant heritage means that the number of people who were born outside of the country who are residents of our state is now actually far less than in some previous years in our history. And so the high point actually was 1870, where there was over 36% of people, residents of Minnesota, were foreign born. And actually a couple other data tidbits here is that up until 1950, Minnesota actually had a higher proportion of foreign born people than the rest of the United States. But today, Minnesota actually has much lower share of people born outside the United States than the United States. So as a whole right now, Minnesota has about 8.4% of its population was born outside of the United States, as compared to almost 14% of the overall population of the United States that was born outside. So that is a little tidbit for you. Okay, and then another question. So if you got it right, congratulations. If you didn't, you have an opportunity to redeem yourself here. So what was the most common immigrant ancestry reported by Minnesotans in 2015? So I'm seeing Mexican, I'm seeing German, I'm seeing Somali. Nobody said Polish yet. Any Ds? No. Okay, so I'm seeing a mixture here. And the answer is actually German. So in 2015, there were over 1.8 million people who reported their immigrant ancestry as German, followed by Norwegian was actually the second at 830,000 people, followed by Irish, which was 569,000. So again, I love the skull in the chat there. So again, just kind of like calibrating what perceptions are with what reality is, just to kind of get us started in this conversation. Okay, so moving on, not recent immigrants versus ancestors. Yes, that was the answer to the last question. Okay. So when we talk about legal pathways to humanitarian protection, again, we're really focusing this conversation on people who have a humanitarian protection status here in Minnesota. And we're going to start with the really the highest level about who are we talking about when we talk about humanitarian protection statuses. And before I get into the different humanitarian protection statuses, I always start with this slide because it is really important that we start out by saying that people are not the immigration status they hold. We often talk about refugees or asylees, and those are immigration statuses. That is not who they are as a person. So when we say refugee or asylee or undocumented or whatever those statuses are, it leaves out mother, child, friend, teacher, farmer, neighbor, scholar, student. And so as we start this conversation, while we are going to talk about different legal statuses, we have to really resist losing people's humanity in an immigration label. Because immigration labels change. People, statuses can be mobile. And so as we start this conversation as well, so there's lots of different reasons that people may come to the United States. Sometimes people choose to leave their countries, and sometimes people are forced to leave. Sometimes people are seeking safety, and sometimes people are seeking opportunity. Sometimes they're reuniting with family. And I used to say that there's a swirl when I would do these presentations. I would say there's a swirl about immigration in our public discourse. And today I would say it's a tornado there in our public and private discourse among policy leaders, around neighbors, around just in our community. And immigration law is complicated and full of processes and nuances that mean a person's immigration status can change over time. And regardless of the reason why they left or arrived to the United States, what the status that they have in immigration law impacts what supports they might be eligible for and what their rights and responsibilities are in the United States, and if they have an opportunity towards permanency or U.S. citizenship in the United States. And so we're going to just dig in a little bit more to, again, the humanitarian protection statuses in particular. The terms that we use in our national and local dialogue, like refugee, like immigrant, like asylee, like undocumented, they're all often used interchangeably in dialogue. And so before we talk about the trends in Minnesota, I'm going to ground us in a little bit of the federal structures and definitions of these words per law. So at the very highest level of classification, sort of like at the very highest level, you have citizens and non-citizens, right? So people who have U.S. citizenship and people who do not have U.S. citizenship. And in the non-citizen sphere, lots and lots and lots and lots of different classifications or lots and lots of different scenarios for statuses that people may have or not have related to if they're not U.S. citizens. What I'm going to focus on today is the subset within all non-citizens. There's a subset of people and statuses that are humanitarian protection statuses. And so when you think about this, the people who have a humanitarian protection status, they're a part of the non-citizen population, but not all non-citizens are a part of that humanitarian protection status. And so again, just a little bit of a different distinction. So like if we think about a particular status like refugee, like all refugees, people with refugee status are non-citizens, not all non-citizens have refugee status. And the terms matter because, as I said before, the classification that is, or the pathway that people enter or have in the United States makes a difference in their rights and responsibilities once they're here. And so yeah, we're going to focus a little bit more on this light blue dot in our conversation today. So again, honing in on that blue dot, reiterating that immigration statuses and pathways are super complicated. In our office at the Department of Human Services in the Resettlement Programs Office, we receive funding from the federal government, at the federal level, the Office of Refugee Resettlement through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we provide resources and funding to help people who fall under this humanitarian protection umbrella to integrate into our communities, to build well-being and to secure employment and self-sufficiency as soon as possible. And because there's a lot of nuances between the different circles below, the circles below are different legal pathways, we just kind of talk about it in general under this umbrella of humanitarian protection. One of the things that is common to all of the green dots under the umbrella is that safety is central to the definition of humanitarian protection. And the experience of flight and persecution are threads that tie all of these different pathways together under this umbrella. The Office of Refugee Resettlement sets definition of which statuses, which pathways are eligible for the services that we fund through our office for people who have a humanitarian protection status. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. So people deserve to live in safety, and throughout Minnesota's history, people have found safety and opportunity here in Minnesota. And as I mentioned before, the origins of the Resettlement Programs Office is tied to people fleeing persecution and seeking safety. I use this slide to show that people seeking safety spans history and geography. We look at this slide, we can see people fleeing fascism after World War II. We see countries in Asia and Africa, such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Liberia. And then we see some more recent images as well of people leaving Syria. So this picture in the upper right-hand corner is an image that we saw a lot in media not so many years ago. This bottom right-hand corner is an image that we also saw a lot in the media of people being evacuated from Afghanistan. And this The most recent picture that we have here right now is actually this bottom left corner, which is people leaving Ukraine after the Russian invasion. And so while the images may change over time, again, this common thread is people seeking freedom and safety. And the US government, over its history, has offered protection to some people who are displaced. Currently, the United Nations data would say that shows that there's more than 122 million forcibly displaced people in the world as of the middle of 2024. And only a tiny fraction of people find protection anywhere in the world, and certainly a tinier fraction in the United States. In fact, less than 0.5% of people who have been forcibly displaced find protection anywhere in the world in a given year. And so in thinking about that, the odds on the individuals who are resettled in the United States have really beaten the odds. And so this is nothing new for us in providing safety to people. Minnesota is a welcoming state. Through our history, we welcome people seeking safety. And we know, and we'll talk about this later as well, that these investments in providing welcome to people when they arrive here have yielded long-term benefits for our state. So I'm going to start by focusing on 4 of the main pathways for humanitarian protection that we have seen in recent years in Minnesota. And so I'm going to focus on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, asylum, special immigrant visas, and temporary protection programs for certain populations. And I'm going to share with you for each one of them what we might expect in the year ahead. Again, a reminder that the federal government makes the decisions about who's admitted, what is the classification of entry. And while that seems really far away, we know that that makes an impact in our state. So we'll talk a little bit about this and what we're seeing as impacts for our neighbors right now. I do see in the chat that there are some questions in there, and I'm making sure to be done with my words within the hour so that we have at least 15 minutes at the end to address any questions that you have that I haven't covered here. So thanks for that. But if you put them in the chat, then we'll go through them as well after I get through the slides. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about the United States Refugee Admissions Program, or USRAP. People who arrive through this pathway are granted refugee status. And eligibility for refugee status, people have to prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group, or their political opinion. They also have to prove through this process that their home government is either unwilling or unable to protect them. And they complete this whole process of screening and vetting overseas. So people who are granted this status when they're living outside their home country and outside the United States. So they're living in a secondary country. The United States government actually processes those applications, does all of the screening, the vetting, the security checks, all of that sort of thing overseas. And then people are invited to resettle. And actually the US government facilitates that resettlement by facilitating the transportation here. So people who arrive with a refugee status, again, this resettlement is facilitated by the US government. The placement location is also determined by the federal government. People have their status is valid indefinitely. If you've ever seen one of the immigration cards, the I-94 cards that they get, it says they get a stamp that says valid and the refugee status valid indefinitely. And that also includes a path to US citizenship after 5 years, as long as they complete designated steps along the way. They're also work authorized upon arrival. And while the US government does facilitate their transportation here, they sign a promissory note before they leave, promising to pay back the cost of their airfare within 5 years after they arrive to the United States. In Minnesota, over the last 50 years, more than 100,000 of our neighbors arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. And let's see here. And it's a long, extensive process that that people go through to arrive through this program. Just a little bit of backdrop of the history of this. For the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, again, it's a federally administered program. Every year, the federal government determines what's the maximum number of people who may be invited to the United States through this program, and that's the blue line that you see on this chart that goes back to 1980 when this program was formalized as the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. So over the course of history, or not history, but back to 1980, on average, the ceiling, they call it the refugee ceiling, has hovered around 80,000, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. It is the president, in consultation with Congress, that defines what is the maximum number of people who may be admitted, as well as what are the priority populations. The orange line underneath here shows the number of people who were actually admitted. So the ceiling is just that, it's a ceiling, not necessarily a goal. And the orange is the number of people who were actually admitted. So you can see different trends over time there. And as you can see, in 2025, that number really dropped off. And as we look forward to 2026, the ceiling, the current ceiling, is set at 7,500 people. So last year, the ceiling had been set at 125,000 people, and this year it is set at 7,500. Just to give a little bit of contrast about how that sits in over the history, again, it's been around 70 or 80,000 over the course of most history, and as you can see by this graph, it's one of the lower, it's the lowest number that has ever been set as a ceiling for U.S. refugee admissions. The other thing that I would just add here, as I said, it is the president in consultation with Congress that sets the priority populations as well. That right now, this program is actually, we're at one more animation here. So this program has actually been suspended. While the ceiling has been set at 7,500 since January of last year, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program was suspended by executive order. And so no people have been arriving, very few people have been arriving through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program since last January, and I'll show you some data related to that as well, what that means for Minnesota. There is one exception, so also by executive order, the president did establish one population who could arrive with refugee status, and that is Afrikaners from South Africa. And so the 7,500 number, 7,500 for the whole United States, that number was set for the United States. It is anticipated that anyone who comes within that number would be an Afrikaners from South Africa. Okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to talk about application for asylum in the United States. So in order for somebody to be eligible for asylum status, they also were forced to flee. So they also fled their home country. They also have to establish a well-founded fear of persecution that meets the same definition that I had mentioned before as a refugee. So a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And they also have to show that their home government is either unwilling or unable to protect them. The one difference, the major difference between refugee status and asylum status is people who are approved refugee status, that status is approved outside of the United States and people are invited to come here. For people who also fled their homeland, they can apply for asylum status if they're in the United States. So that application has to be filed by somebody who's in the United States. So that application, that process, that vetting happens for people while they're in the United States. While that application is being processed, they are legally residing. So somebody arrives to the United States, they file an application with the U.S. government saying, I have a fear of persecution, I am applying for asylum. They submit that application and go through that application here in the United States. It also is reviewed and vetted by the U.S. government, and I'm not going to go into all of the details about that. But if somebody's application for asylum has been pending for more than 150 days, federal law allows them to apply for work authorization. So you have a couple of different things happening. Somebody might arrive to the United States, file for asylum. During the first 150 days, they're not eligible to apply for work authorization. After 150 days, if their application still has not been approved or denied, there's no final decision, they can submit an application for employment authorization. So when you're working with students, when you are encountering people who are in this asylum application process, there's a big difference on that 150 days. Like some people are able to work legally and some people are not able to do that yet. The thing about asylum applications is there's a huge backlog of cases. I think last time I checked in Minnesota, there was over 12,000 or 13,000 pending applications as of 2024. There's about 1.1 million applications pending nationally of this backlog of asylum, people who have applied for asylum and are still waiting for decisions on their cases. So backlog of cases, a lot of barriers for application. There's fees and a whole bunch of things that can sometimes be barriers in addition to limited legal representation. What data tells us is that people who are represented by an attorney as a part of their application for asylum are more likely to be approved. Their application is more likely to be approved than people who are not. And so one barrier is scarcity for legal representation. If somebody is approved, if their application is approved, they do have a permanent status and a pathway to become U.S. citizens, like people who arrive through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. One thing to know about application for asylum right now is that the processing of applications have been formally suspended. So I might have mentioned the backlog, the number of cases that are pending. Those applications have been essentially put on hold. They're not continuing to process those applications at this time. All right, the next classification or the next humanitarian pathway that I'll highlight here is special immigrant visas for Afghan and Iraqi allies. They call them SIV. And so this program was actually enacted by legislation in 2009. So it is for people who worked side by side with U.S. military or government in Iraq or Afghanistan. And as a part of that employment, they were assured that they would have the opportunity to seek safety in the United States. That was recognizing that many people, by working next to the U.S. military, risk their lives to provide that service with the promise of protection and a pathway to resettlement in the United States. So again, eligibility is a person from Iraq or Afghanistan. They have to show certification, or they have to get certification of employment with or on behalf of U.S. operations in one of those countries. Again, promised this opportunity as a part of that employment. People with SIV status, they actually are admitted with a permanent resident status, or they have a green card when they're admitted. They also have a pathway to citizenship in 5 years. They are work authorized upon arrival, the day that they arrive here. In some cases, the U.S. government has facilitated travel here. In some cases, they've traveled themselves. If the U.S. government facilitated travel for them as a part of this process, they also are required to pay back the travel expenses. And they are eligible for federal benefits with the SIV status. Currently, this program is suspended as of the beginning of January. This program was suspended, and that people can no longer submit applications if they're in fear for safety because of their connection with U.S. military operations. The last category that I'm going to talk about here is temporary humanitarian protection statuses. And so there are two kind of main temporary statuses that are pathways to protection in the United States. And both of them are population-based. Both of them are time-limited. In both cases, people may work may apply for legal work authorization. And for neither of them are there a pathway to permanency or U.S. citizenship. So these two categories are humanitarian parole and parole not in the criminal justice sense of parole, but parole in the sense of time limited and conditional. So for humanitarian parole, again, it's a temporary status. Typically, people are granted a humanitarian parole status if they're granted a status for a period of 2 years. In these cases, people are applying from outside of the United States. They're granted permission to enter with a humanitarian parole status. And it's based on country conditions as determined by the U.S. Department of State. So a couple of examples of humanitarian parole programs in recent years has been a program called Uniting for Ukraine, where to promote orderly entry and protection to the United States, the U.S. government created this program that people could apply and enter with this status that was that was valid for 2 years. In most cases, historically, if the situation required extension, people could apply for extensions to their parole or reparole to get that validity made longer. Another example of humanitarian parole was I showed you that picture of the Afghan evacuation. People who were evacuated by the U.S. government and brought to the United States were initially given a humanitarian parole status and then later assisted to apply for asylum, which is a permanent status. So as you can see, that's an example of somebody might enter through a temporary status and then apply for a permanent status, such as asylum. Let's see. So for temporary protective status, this is something that there's been a lot of news out lately around TPS. So TPS, or temporary protection status, is a status given to a country that is deemed too dangerous to return to because of war or violence or natural disaster or some other unstable condition. So the U.S. Congress created this program in 1990, really intending for it to be a way to provide safety for people who were already in the United States, but it was not safe for them to return home because of the situation that was happening in that country. And so that is why when they authorize this program, the authorizations last anywhere when a country is deemed as eligible for temporary protective status, it's typically for a period of 6 months to as long as 18 months. And so immigrants who are granted a temporary protective status, it's somebody who's here, the situation changes in their country is eligible, they make that application, people go through background checks and are vetted by the federal government each time that status is renewed. But it is a program that does not provide a pathway to U.S. citizenship. And so in the last year, so last January, there were 17 countries that were eligible, that were designated as TPS. And in the last year, 11 of those programs have been either revoked or allowed to expire. There's a lot of legal processes going on with the different statuses, and so the courts have gotten involved in many of these situations about the ability to end or not end these programs. But the federal government has designated that they would end these programs for Afghanistan, for Burma, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Nicaragua, South Sudan, Syria, and Venezuela. And as I had mentioned, there's many ongoing legal challenges to some of those designations. Let's see. What is the current status for these programs right now is all of the humanitarian parole programs, that pathway, have been ended. And as I had mentioned, there's 11 nationalities for whom the temporary protective status has also ended. So temporary protective status is very much based on the condition in a country. And so there have been situations where, like, a country situation has allowed for redesignation and redesignation for many years or even decades in some cases. but we're starting to see those designations really come to an end in most cases. And if you look at these two programs, that because they're temporary programs and because they're coming to an end, it leads to a lot of, I don't know what the word is. I'm losing the word right now, but a lot of like vulnerability for people who may come to the end of a status and have to make hard decisions about their safety because they may no longer have a legal status if these statuses end for them. So people who are legally residing, working, engaged in community who may be forced to leave or lose their status here in the United States. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit now. I know there's lots of questions and I'm eager to get to the questions as well. Talk a little bit more now about establishing well-being in Minnesota. So all of the people who I've mentioned before, legally residing, they're on a path allowed to be here seeking safety in Minnesota in the United States. And so one of the roles of our office is to help people establish well-being. And you guys are also really involved in that. But as I said, all of the decisions about who's going to come, what status they might have, eligibility, admission, those are all federal decisions. Those are all federal processes. Our office really steps into the other side, which is the building well-being, again, through some supplemental funding that we get from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement. For people who arrive through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, there's also some programs of initial resettlement where the federal government works directly with nonprofit organizations to help with people in their first 90 days or so in the United States. And then certainly where most of the supports come are from local communities and partners such as you all. To give you just a little history and context about humanitarian protection pathway arrivals in Minnesota, this is a snapshot of the last 5-6 years, I guess, of resettlement here. So you can see there's lots of definitions here. These are the different green dots under that umbrella that I talked about earlier, but all of these folks fit under the umbrella of humanitarian protection status. So this blue, the light bluish color, are people who arrived with refugee status that we mentioned earlier. The dark blue here are people who arrived. These are mostly people who arrived through the Uniting for Ukraine program. So these are people who had a temporary humanitarian protection status. The folks here, down here, this dark blue, are also arrived through that temporary status. These are Afghans who arrived during Operation Allies Welcome. And then the orange are people who were granted asylum. The green is people who, another temporary status, and then the SIV is the purple here. So Afghan and Iraqi special immigrant visa holders. So you can see again that over the course of the last several years, that the last 4 years there were higher numbers. The 4 years before that there were lower numbers. And then if you get before that, then there was a pretty much consistent that we were around between 2,000 or 3,000 people per year since 1980. It's sort of like what the tradition in Minnesota has been. So we've seen some fluctuations in recent years. As we look towards 2026, because of all of the cancellations, because of the ending of these humanitarian protection pathways, we're seeing very few arrivals. So federal year fiscal 2026 started in October of last year, and so far there have been 56 people who have arrived to Minnesota through one of these humanitarian protection pathways. And because those pathways have been suspended or canceled, we're not anticipating to see a lot of new people arrive through these pathways. To get a sense of who those folks are, these are the people who arrived in 2025. In 2025, that was 1,622 people. Most of these people arrived between October, so this is federal fiscal year, so arrived between October of 2024 and January of 2025. There were very few people who arrived after January of 2025. But during that time of these 1,600 people, there were more than 25 different nationalities that were represented. You'll see the largest groups here on this slide. And the next slide will show you by where people live or residing. So this is specifically to U.S. refugee admissions, people who arrived through with refugee status, and so you can see kind of where in our state people were initially residing. When we look to 2026, again, there were only 44 people so far who have arrived, and the people who have arrived have been folks from Afghanistan. Those are primarily people who arrived through the SIB program before January when it ended, and then all others, this 12, are I think they're all Afrikaners from South Africa. So again, as we look forward to the rest of this year of 2026, we're expecting probably fewer than 200 people through any of the pathways, and most of them would be Afrikaners from South Africa, from Minnesota. Okay, and we know, so our office, we do receive federal dollars to supplement, to fill in gaps that other service networks, to not supplant other services, but to supplement. And we know that it takes lots of different engagement from different types of providers with different expertise to help people rebuild their lives here. Again, if you think about the common thread that ties these people's experiences together, it is that fleeing for safety. And so I think often about if I were forced to flee the United States because my government was unwilling or unable to protect me, if I found my way to Haiti, while I have a lot of connections, resources, support networks here, if I were to find myself there, I would need help. I wouldn't speak the language. My professional background probably wouldn't be that useful to me there, and I would need help, and I would need help to reestablish my life. Okay, so when I talk about the next slide that I'm going to have is just going to flash up some headlines about some of the current landscape of things that are destabilizing legally residing households. So people who have made their way here on a humanitarian protection pathway are legally residing households. Most of people are working, have been working hard to build their well-being, and are contributing to our communities. Unfortunately, what has been happening right now is that we're seeing a lot of destabilization due to some federal actions that are happening in our state. So one example is there's on January 9th, the federal government launched something called Operation Paris. That was a federal operation focused on people who arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program who are living in Minnesota, seeking to re-interview people who had already gone through the vetting process, who had not yet received their green card or their permanent residence card. And so what was expected to be a process of calling people in for interviews is what was being anticipated, and people were preparing for that. What actually happened is that on top of immigration operations that were happening, people were being targeted at their homes. They were being arrested on the way to, detained on their way to work. Houses were being surrounded by armed guards who were arresting people and detaining them to be re-interviewed. What we found really quickly, what our partners were explaining to us, is people were being detained and very quickly moved out of state. And what happened after that, there's varying different kinds of situations that happened after that, from people being released in another state with no ID and no resources, needing to find their way back here, to people being released back in Minnesota, to people not being released at all. So this has been something that has been very hard for refugee communities in Minnesota. What our partners are reporting to us, and I'm sure that you're seeing as well, is that a lot of families are, in order to feel safe, they're staying in their homes. And we know that at any given time since January 9th, there's been 100 or more people at any given time who were detained, who are legally residing, arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program with no criminal histories, who had applied for their adjustment of status application, who were being detained. What happened after that is there was a class action lawsuit that was actually filed related to this Operation Paris. Again, it's not happening in other states. It's really only happening in Minnesota at this time, related to the reexamination. So some legal action that was happening. And I can report, I don't have a headline to put up here, but actually yesterday there was a temporary restraining order that was issued related to this, which says that that federal authorities cannot detain people through Operation Paris just because they have refugee status. Related to asylum seekers, again, sort of like the destabilization that's happening, is that people who have applied for asylum, who are waiting, again, legally residing, oftentimes authorized to work, are also being detained in enforcement activities. And Liam Ramos is one person we've seen in the news often that is an example of that happening in Minnesota. Again, I had mentioned the ending of temporary protective status for different populations. Again, that's another headline there. And just, again, sort of the uncertainty for people who have a temporary status, like Ukrainians who escaped war, who are not receiving any sort of, what is being reported to us is that people are awaiting information about if their status can be extended. So a lot of uncertainty for these communities in Minnesota right now. And going back to this slide, there's lots of people who, again, are destabilized, who remain in our community. And while we're not seeing a lot of new people coming, there's a lot of work to be done for the folks who are in our community. If you look back over the last 5 years, there is about 15,000 people who arrived over the last 5 years, who are eligible for the work that we do in our office, the services that we provide, and who are still working to stabilize their lives, build well-being, and what is happening right now is causing a lot of instability that's going to set them back a bit as they continue to seek to stabilize their lives and build well-being here. And so some of the services that we provide in our office, last year our office worked with about 7,300 people who had a humanitarian protection status, as we worked with them to help establish well-being and help them become self-sufficient as soon as possible. This is an example of some of the services that we fund through our office. We work with families through resettlement network services that are listed here. And I won't bore you with all of them, but again, people can access those services during their first 5 years in the United States. If you're interested, and I'll put it again, it'll be up on again at the end, but this is a QR code that will get you to our site that will help you. Oh, thank you, Astrid. That will help people link directly to an immigrant and refugee helpline. So that's a helpline that's staffed actually by folks in our office that would help people connect to services that they might be eligible to anywhere in the state, as well as a list of the specialized services that we offer for people with a humanitarian protection status, and a link to some immigration legal service resources that are available to not just people with a humanitarian protection status, but more broadly as well. And why does this all matter? Lots of reasons that it matters. I mean, first and foremost, I believe it matters because people deserve to live in safety and deserve to be able to establish well-being. And it matters because we know that when newcomers are able to build well-being, we all benefit. And when people do build well-being, there's lots and lots of dividends for our states and our communities. In our office, we often think about this sailboat as a way that we navigate through changing waters of arrival trends and shifting federal laws. And so here in Minnesota, we want to continue, and we always strive to adjust our sails for those changing conditions. again, with the goal of positioning them in the best way to help people build well-being so that we can harness the energy that they bring, and that can propel us all forward together, both in our nation and our communities. And effective resettlement, helping people overcome the challenges and the barriers that they face when they arrive here, requires initial investment, and then it requires initial support of community-based organizations, resettlement agencies, employers, training, all of these things to welcome people and help them integrate into our communities. And a strong resettlement system, that network, is really vital, because when our Minnesota system, when our sales are positioned well, when people are able to be supported in the beginning as they rebuild their lives, then we're able to incorporate and make full use of the energy that people bring with them for a more prosperous Minnesota. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's lots of data that supports that as well. So I've just highlighted two reports that highlight how the initial investment really pays dividends. The first one on the left is a report that was actually commissioned by executive order during the first Trump administration, really seeking to look for what are all of the expenses and what are all the investments that the federal government or the local government make in resettlement for refugees and asylees. This report was actually released not in the first Trump administration. It was actually released during the Biden administration. And what it shows is that the impact, they did a 15-year look, like a longitudinal look about the investments and then the contributions. And what it found is that there's a positive net fiscal impact of over $120 billion in contributions to the U.S. economy over 15 years. So again, really recognizing that there are initial investments that are made in helping people establish well-being. But when they're able to do that successfully, again, the contributions far outweigh the investments that were made in helping them establish that well-being. And then on the right-hand side is a more recent, more local report around the economic contributions of new Americans in Minnesota. This was completed by the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce in February of 2025. And it really highlights the need to continue to expand the labor force in Minnesota for the continued economic growth and the important ways that immigrant populations contribute to that workforce. So again, some really good highlights there for you all as well. But again, you don't have to take the numbers for it either. There are people, behind all of those numbers are people. And so I highlight Abdurrahim Kahin. He's actually the owner of Afro Deli and Grill. He arrived to the United States in 1996 seeking asylum. And today he's an award-winning entrepreneur, restaurateur, philanthropist, and food activist. And actually in 2023, he was named the United States, the National Small Business Person of the Year. Also, I just wanted to highlight, we have other examples as well on our website about people who arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program or were granted asylum, and how they are contributing to Minnesota communities. So if people are interested, we have a bunch of stories on our website. We have posters that are available as well. These are 3 examples of posters. We have them in various languages as well. I'm happy to share out and that are publicly available. And then here again is the same QR code about linking to services. So if you are looking to find ways to connect people to the resources that are available in our community, this is a good first stop for you. It will again point you to the Refugee and Immigrant Helpline. It will provide an interactive map actually for around the state of the services that we fund around the state. And also provides a link to Law Help MN, where there are free legal clinics operating around the state. So with that, that is the end of my formal presentation. And so I think maybe I will start. I think there's a lot of questions. I'm going to scroll my way back up and see if I can look for some questions. Also, if people can feel free to raise their hands. And I guess I would ask Astrid if I can't see the people. So if people raise their hand, if you could help me by calling on, letting me know to call on people, that would be great as
Yes,
well.
absolutely.
Okay. So Katrina asked, how has applying for federal benefits changed for these groups due to the big, beautiful bill? Great question. So HR 1, or the One Big Beautiful Bill, has a lot of impact on eligibility for non-citizens for federally funded programs. So things like SNAP, things like healthcare. There's still a lot of analysis that's happening in the state of Minnesota so far. There hasn't been guidance that's been put out about any changes to federal SNAP benefits, but they are going to be coming. And there's litigation underway. So I'm going to give you a non-answer answer to say as of today, nothing has changed for how people are accessing benefits in Minnesota, but there are changes to come, and that Department of Children, Youth, and Families oversees the SNAP side of things. And so we tell people to look at they're doing a really good job on their website, providing information about updates. And on the healthcare side, the changes for non-citizens would likely take effect in October of 2026. But again, there's still some clarification from the federal government, we are waiting from the federal government to clarify exactly what that policy is. So I'm sorry for the non-answer answer. More information will be coming, but today, nothing has, as of today, implementation in Minnesota, that hasn't changed, but it will be coming. Christina, one of the comments in there is, this rises and falls based on who is president and which political party is in control. So that's an interesting comment. I wish that I would have, for the arrivals to Minnesota, I think it was maybe around arrivals to Minnesota, the last 8 years, we've seen that. But if you look for all of the years before that, that wasn't so much the case. I would say, that prior to, I'm not going to say the year, but prior to 9 years ago, whatever that was, it was pretty consistent. There was pretty good bipartisan commitment to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program that kept arrivals at a pretty steady, level for setting the ceiling. That, before that time, it was never below 60,000 set as a ceiling. So while recent years, there's been changes that, more volatility and changes. Before that, it wasn't so much. Let's see. Please explain more about asylum applications being suspended. I'm going to forget the exact date that it was, but so the federal government decided or put out a policy to suspend further processing of existing asylum applications. So people can still submit asylum applications, like those things can happen, but they're actually not actively processing those forward at this moment. I can't say more than that. That's basically just what they have said as their policy for the Department of Homeland Security. That is what they have said right now. If you Google it, you'll probably find, and there's probably on their website more explanation about that. But I think it was since like mid to end of last year that processing of those applications has been suspended. So with those work permits, be able to continue to work even if their asylee application is suspended. So yes, if people have a work authorization, so their application isn't suspended, I should clarify. So their individual applications are not suspended, but the federal government's processing of those applications is suspended. So those applications are still there. People have work authorizations that are valid for a certain period of time, and they can continue to renew or reapply for work authorization as long as their application has been pending for more than 150 days. Um, what is the document that people with TPS status carry? That is a really good question. I don't actually know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. I think that I know, but I don't want to say it out loud because I'm not sure. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that one. Please talk about what it means for people, students from Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Okay. So for people who have TPS status, so temporary protective status, when those statuses end, when they expire, so there's expiration dates for those statuses. If the federal government doesn't renew that nationality for continued temporary protection status, at the end of that time, when that designation expires, people are no longer legally residing unless they have taken a step to pursue another legal pathway. So, for example, if somebody is here and their current status is they have temporary protective status, if they applied for asylum while they had temporary protective status, then they have an asylum application pending. So if they haven't taken any other steps for any other status at the end of a temporary protection status designation, they would need to leave the United States or they would be considered unlawfully residing. Can I speak to Belarusian immigrants currently in Minnesota or US already? I guess, Ashley, could you say more about that question? I know there have been some Belarusian people who have arrived through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, but I don't know enough about that particular situation unless you could clarify your question a bit. Can I explain why Operation Paris was implemented by the federal government in Minnesota? And is it only happening in Minnesota or elsewhere? I can't explain why Operation Paris was implemented only in Minnesota. There is a press release that if you Google it, Operation Paris, you're going to see a lot of reporting of that. And so I guess I would just encourage people to look to that reporting. I don't pretend to know the motivation behind it. But in talking with my colleagues across the nation, they have not seen, so Operation Paris is specific to Minnesota, and they haven't seen the same sort of detainment activities for refugees, people with refugee status, happening in their states. The press release talked about it as a pilot, so I would anticipate that it may eventually happen other places as well, but I'm not aware of it happening in other states at this point. If a person has a green card, does that mean they are on a pathway to citizenship, even if they came with TPS and that has now been revoked? Great question. This kind of gets to that people's statuses can change. So if somebody has a green card, that means that they do have a pathway to citizenship. So green cards or permanent residency, that's a permanent status. And depending on sort of like, irregardless of how the status that they had before that, if somebody has a green card, there is a pathway to U.S. citizenship for green card holders. Again, with the clarification there that a green card holder, as of any non-citizen, it's required that people temporary set or people who are non-citizens, there's always the possibility that if they break immigration law, if they're not following, if there's some reason that they could have their status revoked, that could happen as well. So again, you can't be committed a felony, those sorts of things that could lead to destabilization of a status, even if you have permanent resident status. So thanks, Marguerite. Let's see. We can make sure the link to the report. So when you get the slides, if you look in the packet, the links are in the slides. Let's see. Might be good ESL activity for those higher level students to read some of those stories. Great suggestion. Okay, so I think, whoops, I'm still looking through.
One more from Amber that just came in a minute ago.
Okay, let's see here. Okay, if an individual from Haiti has TPS, an upcoming date with a judge, but also is possible to have the TPS. Okay, so this is a legal question. I am not an immigration attorney, and I cannot provide legal advice. Um, the best legal advice, not the best legal advice, this is not legal advice. The best advice I can ever give anybody is if they have interactions with the immigration system, they should seek legal counsel. If they don't have legal counsel, there are the link that I provided, the link that's up on the screen right now, that from that QR code has a bunch of places, legal phone lines or clinics that people could go in and get legal advice, and would really encourage anybody who has an interaction with any branch of immigration to seek legal advice. So sorry, I can't dip into that kind of advice. All right. Are there any hands up, Astrid, that you can see?
Not seeing any hands up. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.